They called it the most expensive suicide a citrus grower could commit in a Florida winter. A lush, 30-acre grove of Valencia oranges being intentionally drowned under a continuous spray of water while the mercury in every thermometer from Ocala to Orlando promised to drop so low that the sap inside the trees would turn to jagged ice, expanding until the bark literally exploded. Elias Thorne built his irrigation system anyway, ignoring every dry laugh, every patronizing shake of a neighbor's head, and every urgent warning that he was essentially turning his family's legacy into a 30-acre popsicle. The cold front wasn't just weather. It was a slow-moving executioner. It was a mass of Arctic air that had slipped its polar leash and was now sliding down the peninsula like a silent, invisible scythe. While the other growers in the county were frantically hauling out thousands of smudge pots, ancient soot-belching oil heaters designed to fight a losing battle against the freezing air, Elias was standing at his main pump house, checking the pressure gauges on a series of overhead aspersers. What his neighbors didn't understand, and what Elias had spent weeks calculating on the grease-stained margins of agricultural journals, was a peculiar law of thermodynamics, the latent heat of fusion. He knew that as long as he could keep water moving over the branches, the very process of that water turning into ice would release a tiny, miraculous amount of thermal energy, enough to keep the living tissue at exactly 32 degrees Fahrenheit, even if the air outside plummeted to a lethal 10 below. Elias crouched near the main valve 3 hours before the first frost was scheduled to bite, his calloused hands moving with a surgeon's precision over the iron pipes. The system was a complex web of high-pressure nozzles he had spent his entire savings to install, designed to mist the entire canopy in a fine, relentless fog. His old Australian shepherd, Copper, sat near the pump house door, his ears flattened against his head as the wind began to pick up a hollow metallic whistle. The dog could smell the change in the air, the scent of ozone and the terrifying absence of humidity. Elias felt it too. It was the kind of cold that didn't just touch your skin, it reached inside and gripped your lungs, a reminder that nature didn't care about your mortgage or your heritage. His 30 acres of oranges were at their most vulnerable state, the fruit heavy on the branches, a week away from a harvest that was supposed to pay for his daughter's college and clear the debts of a bad summer. The traditional wooden windbreaks and the plastic coverings his father had used for 40 years wouldn't be enough this time. The air was too dry, the wind too fast. The black frost was coming. Black. A phenomenon that steals the moisture from the cells of a plant so quickly they turn black and brittle before the sun even rises. He had tried to explain the physics of the ice shield to his neighbor, Clayton Big K. Miller, a week ago at the local co-op. Clayton had looked at Elias's diagrams, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, and laughed, a sound like dry leaves being crushed under a boot. "You're going to freeze him from the inside out, Thorne," Clayton had said, his voice dripping with the confidence of a man who believed tradition was the only shield worth having. "Water causes ice, ice kills oranges. My boy in 3rd grade knows that much. You're building a tomb of glass, Elias, and you're paying for the privilege of burying your own trees." Elias hadn't argued. He had just kept working, adjusting the spray patterns to ensure every square inch of bark would be coated. By sunset, as the sky turned the color of a bruised plum and the temperature hit the freezing mark, 3 trucks slowed down as they passed the Thorne property. Men leaned out of windows, pointing at the mist already beginning to swirl through the groves. One of them, a veteran grower named Silas Vance, actually stopped his truck, leaving the engine idling while he stared at the spectacle. "You know, Elias, water is an insulator in a pond," Silas said, leaning over his steering wheel with a look of genuine pity. "But on a branch in a 10-mile-an-hour wind, it's a heat sink. You're accelerating the freeze. You're turning your orchard into a crystal cemetery." Elias wiped a layer of freezing mist from his forehead, his breath coming out in thick white plumes that vanished into the darkening grove. "It's not about the ice, Silas. It's about the phase change. If I keep the water flowing, the temperature stays at 32. The fruit won't freeze as long as the ice is wet." Silas looked at him like he had started speaking a dead language. To a man who had fought frosts with fire for half a century, the idea of using ice to fight cold was a heresy. He shook his head, put the truck in gear, and drove off, leaving Elias alone with the rising roar of the pumps. By midnight, the transformation began. The fine mist hit the leaves and instantly crystallized. A shimmering, transparent layer of ice started to thicken around every orange, every leaf, and every delicate twig. The orchard began to groan under the added weight, a sound of strained wood and shifting glass that echoed through the silent, freezing night. To any observer, it looked like a catastrophe in slow motion, a 30-acre forest of diamonds frozen solid and glittering under the moonlight. Clayton Miller drove by one last time at 2:00 a.m., his truck loaded with extra fuel for his smudge pots. He stopped, watched the ice-laden branches sagging toward the ground, and whispered a single word to the empty air: idiocy. He drove off, convinced that by dawn, Elias Thorne would be the only man in the county with 30 acres of firewood and not a single orange left to sell. But in 48 hours, the silence of the black frost would tell a story that the men with the smudge pots would never forget. Part 2. The screaming silence of the black frost. By 3:30 a.m., the temperature did something that even the oldest farmers in the county hadn't seen in 30 years. It dropped another 6 degrees in 40 minutes. The humidity had vanished completely, leaving the air so dry and brittle that it felt like breathing powdered glass. This was the black frost, the silent killer that doesn't leave a pretty white coating of rime on the ground, but instead reaches into the very cellular structure of a plant and sucks the life out of it, turning green leaves into blackened, charred husks before the sun can even rise. Across the fence line, on Clayton Miller's property, the scene was one of frantic, prehistoric desperation. Hundreds of smudge pots were belching thick, oily black smoke into the air, creating a low-hanging cloud that Clayton hoped would trap whatever heat was left in the soil. Men were running between the rows, their faces smeared with soot and grease, desperately tossing more fuel into the iron pots, their shadows dancing like demons against the orange flicker of the fires. But the wind was Clayton's enemy. Every time a gust of the Arctic gale swept through, it stripped the warmth from the smudge pots and carried it a mile away in seconds. Clayton stood in the middle of his grove, his eyes red from the smoke and the cold, watching as the plastic tarps he had painstakingly draped over his prize trees began to shred under the force of the wind. He could hear the terrifying sound of the frost winning, the subtle, crystalline snap of orange skins bursting as the juice inside expanded into ice. Every snap was $1 lost. Every snap was a piece of his future dying in the dark. He looked over at Elias Thorne's property and saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Elias's orchard didn't look like a farm anymore. It looked like a scene from an alien planet. The overhead aspersors were still screaming, pumping thousands of gallons of water into the freezing air. Every branch, every leaf, and every single Valencia orange was now encased in a thick, translucent sheath of ice, some layers nearly an inch thick. The weight was immense. The trees were bowing toward the earth, their heavy limbs groaning under the crystalline burden, some of them sagging so low they touched the frozen dirt. To Clayton and the other men watching from the road, it was the ultimate confirmation of Elias's madness. They saw a man who wasn't just losing his crop. He was physically crushing his trees under the weight of his own arrogance. Elias was out there, moved by a kinetic energy that defied his 60 years. He wasn't in the pump house anymore. He was walking the rows, a long pole in his hand, his heavy rubber boots crunching through the frozen slush that had accumulated on the ground. He was moving from tree to tree, clearing ice from the specific drainage points he had designed, ensuring that the water didn't pool and drown the roots. His skin was a frightening shade of pale blue. His eyebrows were thick with frozen mist, and his hands, wrapped in heavy industrial neoprene, were shaking with the onset of hypothermia. Every time a branch groaned too loudly, Elias felt a jolt of pure terror. He was gambling on the structural integrity of the wood versus the thermal protection of the ice. "One more hour," Elias whispered to himself, his voice a ragged rasp that was barely audible over the roar of the pumps. Just one more hour of flow. The science was brutal but elegant. As long as the sprinklers kept hitting the ice, a thin film of liquid water remained on the surface. That water was the key. As it froze into the existing ice, it released the latent heat of fusion, keeping the internal temperature of the orange at exactly 32 degrees, the magic number where the fruit stays chilled, but the juice inside doesn't freeze. If the pumps failed for even 10 minutes, the wet ice would become dry ice, and the temperature would plummet to match the lethal 12 degrees of the outside air, killing the trees instantly. At 4:45 a.m., the main pump hissed and sputtered. Elias froze. The mechanical rhythm he had relied on for 6 hours stumbled. A seal in the primary intake pipe, brittle from the cold, had begun to crack. Elias sprinted toward the pump house, his lungs screaming as the freezing air hit them. If the pressure dropped now, the mist would turn into a drizzle, and the drizzle would freeze into a solid block that would stop the rotation of the aspersors. He burst into the small corrugated shed, the smell of diesel and hot oil hitting him like a physical blow. He saw the leak, a fine spray of water hitting the engine block, turning into steam. With no time for a proper fix, Elias did something that would have made a safety inspector faint. He stripped off his own heavy wool scarf, soaked it in a bucket of warm engine coolant, and wrapped it around the cracked pipe, binding it tight with a length of baling wire. He held it in place with his bare, calloused hand, using his own strength to keep the seal from bursting under the pressure. The metal was so cold it felt like it was burning through his skin, a searing, white-hot agony that radiated up his arm. He gritted his teeth, his vision swimming with pain, and held on. Outside, the aspersors began to hum with a steady rhythm once more. Across the field, Clayton Miller gave up. His fuel was gone, his men were exhausted, and the frost had turned his leaves to black parchment. He climbed into his truck, his heater blasting, and stared through the windshield at the glittering frozen fortress of Elias Thorne. "He's a fool," Clayton muttered, trying to convince himself as he watched the ice on Elias's trees grow even thicker under the moonlight. There won't be a single branch standing by sunrise. He's buried them all. The dawn didn't bring warmth. It brought a cold, indifferent clarity that exposed the true scale of the night's brutality. As the sun finally crested the horizon, it didn't look like the golden orb of the Florida postcard. It was a pale, frozen coin hanging in a sky the color of a dead man's lips. The wind had finally died down to a hollow, ghostly whistle, leaving a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Across the county, the black frost had finished its work. On Clayton Miller's property, the hundreds of smudge pots had burned down to cold, greasy craters of ash. The thick black smoke had cleared, revealing a scene of agricultural carnage. Every single tree in Clayton's prize grove was a skeletal ghost. The leaves, once a vibrant, deep green, had turned a sickly, translucent charcoal, dead tissue that would soon crumble into dust. The fruit on his branches was ruined, the rinds shriveled and pitted where the ice had formed inside the pulp, expanding with enough force to destroy the juice vesicles and leave nothing but a bitter, mushy pulp behind. Clayton stood by his truck, his face aged a decade in a single night, his soot-stained hands trembling as he reached out to touch a leaf that snapped off like a piece of burnt paper. He had spent $10,000 on fuel and labor, and in return he was looking at 30 acres of firewood. Then he looked across the fence. Elias Thorne's orchard was no longer a farm. It was a cathedral of light. As the first rays of the sun hit the 30 acres of ice-encrusted trees, the entire property ignited into a blinding, prismatic explosion of color. Every branch was encased in a thick, crystal-clear sheath of ice that acted like a magnifying glass, catching the morning light and throwing rainbows across the frozen ground. To the casual observer, it looked like a total loss, a forest of glass that surely must have crushed the life out of everything beneath it. The weight was so immense that some of the older trees were bent nearly double, their tops touching the snow-dusted earth in a posture of forced prayer. The pumps were still roaring, the aspersors still spinning, adding a final, shimmering layer of wetness to the frozen monuments. Elias was still there, leaning against the doorframe of the pump house, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with frost, his body swaying with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. He looked like a man who had gone to war with a ghost and wasn't entirely sure if he had won. By 9:00 a.m., the temperature finally crawled back above the freezing mark. Elias reached out with a hand that was raw and swollen, his skin a patchwork of red and purple, and slowly turned the main valve. The roar of the pumps died, replaced by the rhythmic, heavy dripping of 1,000 melting icicles. This was the moment of truth, the wet melt. If his calculations had been off by even a fraction of a degree, if the water pressure had dropped or the latent heat hadn't been enough, the fruit inside those ice shells would be just as dead as Clayton's. A crowd began to gather at the perimeter fence. Word had traveled fast through the emergency radio bands. Men who had lost everything that night, Silas Vance, Vernon Brask, and half a dozen others, stood in their heavy coats watching in a mixture of disbelief and growing hope. They watched as the ice began to slide off the leaves in massive crystalline sheets, shattering on the ground with the sound of breaking windows. Elias walked to the nearest tree, a heavy Valencia that had been bowed almost to the breaking point. He reached up and pulled a thick, hollow tube of ice off a single orange. The fruit fell into his hand, cold and wet, but its skin was a brilliant, defiant, electric orange. There were no shriveled pits. There was no blackened rind. He took a small pocket knife from his belt, his fingers clumsy and numb, and sliced the fruit in half. The juice sprayed out, bright and fragrant, the pulp firm and perfect. The ice hadn't been a tomb, it had been an incubator. The latent heat released by the freezing water had kept the interior of that ice shell at exactly 32 degrees, while the air outside had been a lethal 12 below. The black frost had been locked out by the very thing everyone feared most. Clayton Miller climbed over the fence, his boots crunching through the shards of Elias's crystal cemetery. He walked up to Elias, looking at the perfect, halved orange in the man's hand, then up at the tree. Beneath the melting ice, the leaves were green, deep, healthy, waxy green. The tree wasn't dead. It wasn't even shocked. It was ready for the spring. Clayton picked up a leaf that had just shed its ice armor and rubbed it between his fingers. It didn't crumble. It flexed. It was alive. "I called you a fool, Elias," Clayton said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that broke the silence of the melting grove. "I sat in my truck and watched you drown your life's work, and I thanked God I wasn't as crazy as you." He looked back at his own blackened, dead trees, then back at the shimmering emerald green life surrounding them. "I spent my father's savings on fire and smoke, and I lost it all. You spent yours on water and ice. And you're the only man left with a harvest." Elias didn't gloat. He didn't have the energy for it. He just handed the other half of the orange to Clayton. "It wasn't about being crazy, Clay. It was just the physics of the phase change. The water wanted to give its heat away. I just gave it a place to go." By noon, the Thorne orchard was a muddy, dripping mess. But it was a mess filled with life. The other growers didn't go back to their own ruined farms. They stayed. They followed Elias through the rows, their voices hushed, their eyes wide as they touched the living branches. They were men who had lived by tradition for 3 generations, men who believed that how it's always been done was the only way to survive. But standing there in the middle of a resurrection made of glass, they realized that the world had changed. The black frost had proven that tradition without understanding is just a slow way to fail. Elias Thorne had proven that sometimes, to save the thing you love, you have to be willing to bury it in the very thing everyone says will kill it. The weeks that followed the Great Freeze of '89 were not filled with the typical sounds of a Florida spring. Instead of the hum of tractors and the chatter of picking crews, a heavy funeral silence hung over the county. From the air, the landscape looked like a patchwork quilt of death. Thousands of acres of once vibrant citrus groves had turned into brittle gray skeletons. The smell of rotting vegetation and drying wood filled the air as growers began the heartbreaking task of bulldozing their family legacies into massive burn piles. Clayton Miller's property was a graveyard. He had lost 90% of his trees, the black frost having cracked the very trunks of his Valencias down to the rootstock. But in the center of this devastation, Elias Thorne's 30 acres stood like a lush emerald island in a sea of ash. The harvest on the Thorne property was the most watched event in the history of the district. When the first semi-trucks pulled into the driveway, the pickers didn't find frozen mush or shriveled rinds. They found fruit that was heavier, sweeter, and more hydrated than any previous year. The layer of ice hadn't just protected the oranges, it had prevented the dry Arctic wind from sucking the moisture out of the trees. Elias's yield was record-breaking, but more importantly, he was the only supplier left in a market where the price of citrus had tripled overnight. The suicide mission had turned into the most profitable gamble in the history of the Thorne family, clearing 3 generations of debt in a single picking season. But the true legacy of that night wasn't found in Elias's bank account. It was found in his shed. Every evening for a month, the same trucks that had once slowed down to mock him were now parked in a neat row in his driveway. Men like Silas Vance and even a humbled, quiet Clayton Miller sat on overturned crates, clutching thermoses of coffee while Elias stood at a chalkboard he'd rigged up against the wall. He wasn't teaching them how to farm, they already knew that. He was teaching them physics. He explained the latent heat of fusion over and over, drawing diagrams of water molecules and thermal barriers until the men who had spent their lives fighting ice finally understood that ice was the only thing that could have saved them. Clayton Miller was the one who proposed the change to the county agricultural charter. He stood up at the next town hall meeting, his voice still rough from the soot he'd inhaled that night, and looked at the rows of devastated farmers. "We spent 50 years fighting the cold with fire because that's what our grandfathers did," Clayton said, gesturing toward Elias, who sat in the back row trying to remain invisible. "We called him a fool because he used his head instead of his pride. Next year my grove will have aspersers, not smudge pots. And if any of you want to keep your land, yours will too." The Thorne method eventually became the gold standard for frost protection across the entire citrus belt. The sight of an orchard encased in glass during a freeze transitioned from a sign of madness to a mark of high-level engineering. Elias Thorne lived to see his crystal cemetery become a blueprint for survival, though he remained a man of few words. He never reminded Clayton of the idiocy comment, and he never bragged about the millions he made when the rest of the county was broke. He simply continued to walk his rows, listening to the hum of the pumps, knowing that in the battle between tradition and the laws of the universe never loses. On the wall of the local co-op, next to the weather bulletins and the cattle prices, there's a framed photograph from that dawn in 1989. It shows Elias standing among his frozen trees, the sun turning his orchard into a blinding forest of diamonds. Below it, someone, perhaps Clayton, had carved a short sentence into the wooden frame. "The man who had the courage to freeze his world to keep it alive."